going to read some excerpts from a Bob Dylan song that expresses some very typical themes of the 1960s. Personal freedom, living in the present, radical self-expression, openness to very intense experiences, and altered states of consciousness. Take me on a trip upon your magic swirling ship. My senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel to grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. I'm ready to go anywhere. I'm ready for to fade into my own parade. Cast your dancing spell my way. I promise to go under it. Take me disappearing through the smoke rings of my mind, down the foggy ruins of time, far past the frozen leaves, the haunted, frightened trees, out to the windy beach, far from the twisted reach of crazy sorrow. Yes, to dance beneath the diamond sky, with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea, circled by the circus sands, with all memory and fate driven deep beneath the waves. Let me forget about today until tomorrow. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy. There is no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle, jangle morning, I'll come following you. In a book called To a Dancing God, the psychologist Sam Keen wrote, God, give me madness that does not destroy wisdom, responsibility, love. This prayer seems to be asking for intensity and wild abandon. To dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free would fit right in there. But Sam goes on to pray for a remarkably sane sort of madness that balances passion with control. I'm going to explore this theme today, drawing upon some sermons I preached here in 2007. I believe all of us need passion and structure. Passion and structure. Our country has been very strongly shaped by the Northern European heritage, and Northern Europeans are known for structure. Highly structured, efficient social systems that enable them to master technology, the environment, and other human beings. Back when I was growing up, in the mid-20th century, the men of these male-dominated cultures were shrewd businessmen and disciplined soldiers. However, they often found it hard to be vulnerable or childlike and frequently could not dance. During the 1950s, bongo-bopping beatniks and other radicals suggested we shake up our social structures and strictures. These rebellious dreamers planted seeds that sprouted, and by the 1960s, millions of us were celebrating passion more than control. Let's consider how new forms of emotionality and sensuality unfolded in 5 different arenas: politics, popular music, lifestyles, religion, and psychotherapy. And in all 5 cases, the 60s clearly grew out of the 50s. In politics, the 1950s witnessed the struggle for racial integration, a disciplined and orderly crusade for equality, which inspired the student movement and New Left politics. New Left leaders did some pretty zany things. Jerry Rubin used to walk around in public with a notorious 4-letter word emblazoned upon his forehead. Some of you may remember Abby Hoffman's publication called Steal This Book. I won't ask how many of you took the title literally. In popular music, Rebellion against the structured status quo began in the lower torso gyrations of, it was mentioned earlier, Elvis Presley. But by the 1960s, Elvis looked tame compared to the hippies with their acid rock music and day-glow colors. Back when many of us were proud to be called freaks, we were different with a capital D, and you could sure tell that by looking at us. I have a little visual aid here. Thank you, Mike. Would you believe that in 1970, I bought this walking rainbow at Sears. I'll display some photos from the 60s at the book table afterward. The extravagant sounds and colors of psychedelic rock concerts offered a way of getting high. Being high, of course, was associated with drugs, psychedelic drugs. And of course, psychedelic means mind expanding. But many flower children searched for a natural high. They either abstained from drugs or moderated their use for the same reasons they avoided eating red dye number 2. With or without LSD, the goal was to soar above everyday consciousness. The greatest psychedelic rock concert I ever attended featured Janis Joplin in Los Angeles. As the musicians tuned up, Janis wasn't waiting demurely in the wings to make a grand entrance. She skittered all over the stage, hopping up and down with anticipation. She looked like a kid on Christmas morning about to tear into her first present. And she tore into that first song with a depth of feeling that equaled the final crescendo of most rock concerts. Then she built intensity upon wildness, upon abandon, to a state I've never seen before or since. I doubt that such an explosion is possible except in a culture where feelings have been suppressed. In the area of lifestyles, once again, the 1950s paved the way. During the Eisenhower era, hep cats poked fun at the squares of conventional America. In high school, kids hid Mad Magazine behind the covers of their textbooks. But by the 1960s, there was an entire countercultural movement, group living arrangements, alternate ways of acquiring income, and all sorts of experimentation in relationships. With Stephen Stills singing on the radio, "If you can't be with the one you love, honey, love the one you're with." In religion, radical spiritual leaders were moving in two very different directions. In the Death of God movement, we had theologians who rejected theism, but some traditional forms of spirituality were enormously popular. People studied Native American lore, pagan tradition, astrology, the occult, and wisdom of the East. "What's your sign?" became a standard pickup line. Alongside these mutations in politics, popular music, lifestyles, and religion, there were new forms of psychotherapy. Alexander Lowen, the founder of bioenergetics, had been a lonely voice in the 1950s, calling for emotional catharsis through a therapy that involved both mind and body. But in the 1960s, thousands signed up for encounter groups, body awareness workshops, and experiential psychotherapy. All this was known collectively as the Human Potential Movement. I was deeply involved in that movement, and I led marathon encounter sessions up to 25 hours long. In theological school, I discovered I had very little contact with my emotions. I wanted to let go and loosen up. So in the early 1970s, I went into therapy with a radical outfit called Community of the Whole Person in Washington, D.C. Therapy groups at the community were very serious. No small talk chit-chat. Participants were expected to arrive 15 minutes early to warm up. And warming up consisted of working with each other in pairs using Alexander Lowen's physical bioenergetic exercises. The goal was essentially to whip ourselves into an emotional frenzy by the time the therapist walked in the door. Such effusiveness sounds peculiar today, but it certainly felt satisfying at the time. Remembering those amazing days, I feel a sense of loss as our future-shocked culture races through the 20th century, leaving the 60s as out of date as those old bell-bottom pants. The Woodstock Festival seems like another world. Think about the contrast that people in my generation have experienced between, say, 1969 and 2019. 1969, radical politics. 2019, radical right. 1969, free love. 2019, safe sex. 1969, looking for the perfect high. 2019, looking for the perfect high-yield mutual fund. 1969, acid rock. 2019, acid reflux. 1969, Rolling Stones. 2019, kidney stones. 1969, going to a new hip joint. 2019, getting a new hip joint. So what happened? Besides the fact that we all got older, I think the pendulum swung too far, too fast, from too much square structure to extravagant, shapeless, unrestrained emotionality. Too often, the surging energy of the 60s smashed the structures we were trying to create, like a flash flood obliterating a little picket fence. We generated more passion than we could control. Sometimes structures can protect us from our own weaknesses. The New Left collapsed because it had no workable plan for lasting change. We needed more than confrontation politics and guerrilla theater to gain power in a country that elected Richard Nixon president in 1968. In the same election, running on a platform of bringing back racial segregation, George Wallace carried 5 states and won 46 electoral votes. Even today, progressives don't know how to help racists see that people of other cultures and ethnicities are not the enemy. Back in the 60s, preventing nuclear war was a huge priority. And one could argue today that it should still be our first priority. But I don't really think that preventing the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in a nuclear holocaust should be our first priority. I think it should be our first 1,000 priorities. Then we could discuss what issue should rank as number 1001. Now that North Korea can actually nuke the United States, our government is finally focusing on this issue in ways that leave me mostly baffled and appalled. However, I still hope that the theatrics going on in Korea this weekend will lead to something substantive. Alternate lifestyles, In popular culture, I still love psychedelic rock, but it was too overblown to last. Steppenwolf sang, "Fire all of your guns at once and explode into space." Okay, but what do you do for an encore? Many of the most creative musicians were just too wild for their own survival, and usually their deaths were drug-related. Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, and a bunch of others. Alternate lifestyles also lacked adequate structural underpinnings. Only a few experiments in communal living or unorthodox ways of working have survived, and we discovered that free love can be incredibly expensive. But all of this experimentation did help us break out of rigid categories, paving the way for gay rights and gender fluidity. Although the Death of God movement soon faded from the headlines, unorthodox spiritualities still flourish, and Unitarian Universalists have learned a lot from pagan, Native American, and Eastern traditions. And radical psychology could be considered a qualified success. Many counselors worried that emotionally intense experiences would make people snap, and in groups where participants were coerced to do things against their will, or bombarded with criticism, as in the so-called Synanon game, this did happen. But in most people, powerful emotions are less dangerous than they seem as long as one is led gently rather than being pushed. So the counterculture ran into some obstacles. But there is one huge overall obstacle, which is that social evils are deeply rooted in human nature. And now, of course, I'm speaking from the position of advanced age. Back then, with the fervor of youth, I saw dazzling possibilities everywhere. Now I see daunting limitations everywhere. And both perspectives are valuable. I think of human nature in the context of the long and difficult journey of living creatures. Through the struggle for survival, simple animals evolved into creatures with high intelligence and a rich inner life of conscious experiences. But as Buddhism teaches us, we conscious creatures are trapped on a dizzying roller coaster ride of pain and pleasure, desire and frustration. Some of us have realized we are caught in this trap and have imagined breaking free. This can lead to a mindful and proactive insurrection, a purposeful rebellion against biological programming. And this act of revolutionary defiance, this revolt against blind nature, turns what had been a mindless wandering into a mindful quest for liberation. As one important example of how challenging it is to transcend human nature, think about patriarchy, male dominance. In humans, there seems to be something about the way human beings are put together that has enabled male-dominated societies to conquer and subdue other societies all over the world. And this typically leads to a lot of oppression. Recently, Mark Rahman in this pulpit quoted a Bible story about the time when, quote, men literally owned their children, with ownership defined as the ability to use and abuse and having the power of life and death. Fortunately, we've made a lot of progress in recent centuries, and these days male dominance is being challenged as never before. Due to the Me Too movement, legions of male leaders have lost their jobs after being charged with inappropriate behavior. And that's not just something that is involved as an issue with politicians and entertainment stars. A recent survey of professional economists revealed that nearly 100 female economists say a peer or colleague has sexually assaulted them. And hundreds that they were stalked or touched inappropriately. Economists? Janet Yellen, former chair of the Federal Reserve, said, "What you see in this survey is just an unacceptable culture." Yes, indeed. On the other hand, how far shall we go to keep people from feeling intruded upon? Think about Joe Biden. No one accuses him of assault, but some say Biden's hugs are overly friendly. Nancy Pelosi commented that, "I'm a member of the Straight Arm Club." In greeting someone, she pretends both parties have colds and suggested Biden do the same. But I remember family therapist Virginia Satir saying we need 4 hugs a day for survival, 8 hugs a day for maintenance, and 12 hugs a day for growth. I myself was strongly influenced by Ashley Montague's book, Touching: The Human Significance of the Skin. And I remember back in the 60s when therapists taught people how to give real hugs. Like this. Not like this. And now we have the Nancy Pelosi hug. I don't think we can know how far we need to go to protect people from unwanted touch until we fully grasp the extent of male dominance in this culture. And clearly that is still in the process of being revealed. So maybe Pelosi is right. But, on the other hand, I bet a lot of people have liked Joe Biden's hugs. As a child of the 60s, I hope we can keep people safe without making our stressed and very uptight world just a little bit colder. Into a Dancing God, Sam Keen prayed for a sensible madness that does no terrible harm. Today, the Woodstock era challenges us, asking, is there enough passion in your life? Do you feel your own intensity, your zany playfulness, your animal wildness? Or is it buried so deep you can't find it anymore? And how can you take the intensity that hides in your heart and manifest it through practical structures? We do have to cope with everyday chores, pay the rent, mop the floor. But there are also times to sail off on a trip upon some magic swirling ship. Regardless of whether we agree with them, we owe a lot to the misfits and geniuses who challenge society with fearless critiques. Their lives provoke us to feel new passions and shape new structures. Dylan's tambourine man still calls us in the jingle-jangle morning. John Lennon still dares us to imagine. Janis and Jimi Hendrix and Jerry Garcia, in a very real sense, they are all still alive. Regardless of whether we are young or old, I hope we are alive enough to stand up and dance with them.